Hello there friends and enemies, my name is O'Shea, and this is the Demon Rush Legends Corrupt. Have you ever found a video game that you know it was your birthright to play? Like you were born and Destiny's idea was to have you play this game? I don't quite remember exactly how I found out about the Demon Rush Legends Corrupt, but when I saw it, I immediately knew that this game was my fate in life. Having finally had a chance to play it, there is a lot to say about this game. So let's get into it. The Demon Rush Legends Corrupt is a indie RPG created by Dragoon Entertainment in June 3rd, 2020 for the PlayStation 4, June 30th, 2020 for the PlayStation Vita, and January 29th, 2021 for PC. The game was created as a remake of their original 2D RPG from 2008, The Demon Rush, which as of the filming of this video is not available to actually be played. For the sake of brevity for the rest of the video, I'm going to be calling the Demon Rush Legends Corrupt simply the Demon Rush because it makes the entire process of talking about this game so much easier. I should also state that I tried to get an original version of the Demon Rush to play in order to add substance to this review, but I wasn't actually able to get my hands on it. But there is a playthrough of it on YouTube. Also, as a final side note, it's worth noting that this entire game was created by one guy. I don't know if that's true for the entirety of Dragoon Entertainment's game catalog, but it makes a whole lot of sense. Upon opening this game, the first thing that I noticed is that the tutorial is disconnected from the actual story mode. This is fine, sometimes people do this, but it seems to me like it would be a much better decision when making a game to have your tutorial be integrated into the first part of the game. That way, your players can choose to play the tutorial. You can make it skippable so that if they don't want to get any training on how to play the game, they can just skip it. Speaking of skippability, cutscenes in this game are not skippable, which seems like a big oversight, especially for a game where you can easily die and have to go all the way back to your last save, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Immediately apparent to me was the fact that the way that the camera works and the way that the combat works feels really bad on a keyboard and mouse. I wish I could have connected a controller to this game. It feels like it was kind of made with controllers in mind, but unfortunately the PC port of the game does not have controller support. I will, however, say that as the game went on, I felt a little bit better about using the controls in combat. It got easier the more that I was able to understand how the game kind of wanted me to use the camera controls. And let me say, the camera controls are kind of awful. Every map in this game kind of sticks to a singular box. The maps in this game are made kind of weirdly, but because of the fact that they are boxes, the camera often collides with the edge of the map. And the edge of the map is not exactly the edge that you see. If you walk around, you can see that you'll get stuck kind of close to the edge, and I believe that that's where the edge of the map is. So it causes, when you're walking around in the overworld, and especially when you're doing combat in small areas, it causes a really terrible effect for the camera to kind of wamble in and out, which is kind of awful. I would have liked there to be some sort of settings to make the camera feel a little bit better, or at least make the camera just be a static over-the-shoulder third-person camera, kind of go for like a Final Fantasy 16 type of feel, but it's whatever. However, going back to getting stuck on the map, the controls are kind of non-responsive. Once you get stuck on the edge of something, you are just stuck. You can't move. You have to move backwards in order to move again, which really slows down the pace of gameplay sometimes, especially if you aren't exactly sure where the edge of something is, which you never are. Combat introduces a hotkey system, kind of like an MMO, but in my personal opinion, it's done in a kind of weird and not great way. I wish that your hotkeys were customizable so that you could customize which skills went to which button, but you are delegated to having every single skill that you unlock on your hotkeys, which means you aren't using just the numbered keys, you're also using the E through U keys on your keyboard. This makes for kind of sloppy gameplay, especially when it comes to combat, and I'll talk a little bit more about how skills work later when I actually discovered in gameplay how the game wanted me to use the skills. While we're still stuck on combat, it's worth noting that the way that combat works makes it difficult, not because enemies are specifically difficult, but because of the way the game doesn't really help you in combat. There is a targeting system, but it's not for your playable character. It's only for the other NPCs in your party. You cannot target an enemy, which makes actually hitting them with your skills and sometimes your attacks really difficult. Me, being the person that I am, I like to play as what I perceive as the main character, which in this game would be Cherry Venus. She has a move that's kind of helpful that stops opponents from moving around, but that really doesn't help too much, especially given that at max upgrade, it doesn't give you a whole lot of time to do that. That's another thing. Enemies in this game move way faster than you could ever hope to. It was really hard to land a hit on enemies if I didn't have my Fortify skill, the one that stops them from moving, because they simply zip around the battle arena like nothing. And this makes not only attacking them hard, but also getting away from them and healing really difficult as well. Especially if you don't remember what hotkey you're meant to press to heal. You have to hit shift in order to see what all the hotkey skills are, which kind of makes combat slow down a lot and isn't really player friendly. The original Demon Rush had a turn-based combat system, and I feel like these issues could be levied by incorporating that into this game. However, there were a couple things that I enjoyed as a result of this. At the end of every battle, as long as you win, you automatically heal. All of your party members that are currently equipped will automatically heal to their full health, which I thought was really good. I keep talking about skills, so let me go into that really quick. In the menu, there's something called the Soul Triad, which is kind of like the sphere grid from Final Fantasy X, but much simpler, which I really like. I like being able to see which nodes I'm about to equip and what they do and how they affect my skills. I would have liked this a lot more if skills during combat were handled just a little bit better. Maybe having the skills stand at the bottom of the screen in different icons, much like an MMO, and then when they're about to cool down, you just have them gray out with a little timer movement in there. That would have been much better than the way that cooldowns work in this game, where they're kind of just shoved off to the side, where you're not going to look at them because you're trying to pay attention to the enemies that are constantly running at you. Moving away from combat real quick, I want to talk once again about the maps, specifically about the oversimplicity of the maps. I'm going to talk later about the art direction of the game, but because the art direction takes a minimalist and oversimplified type of direction, the maps can be kind of hard to parse, with you not necessarily knowing exactly when there's supposed to be like a down ramp or something such as that. And when you have an up ramp in a map where you're supposed to be walking sort of up a hill or a mountain, there's no way to move the camera above the eye level of the character, so you can't really see if there's something up on top of the mountain for you to prepare for. Which once again goes back to camera settings. I wish we could have set the camera to be sort of free floating and move through solid objects, or move past the view line of the characters. Now, I got about halfway through the game before I got my first game over, and this is when I realized what I believe to be the worst part of the game. When you start the game up, the game tells you that it has an autosave system, but only for specific certain things, but it doesn't quite tell you exactly what those mean. When you see that it says autosave records, you would assume that that means it autosaves where you are in the game. This is not the case. In fact, records don't even apply to the story mode, only the achievements that you get throughout the story do. So it's really weird that there's a autosave mechanic that doesn't actually work. And what I mean by this, and this is where I got really angry, when you get a game over, if you haven't gotten a game over in this game and you're expecting the autosave to save you, give up that expectancy right now. You can only load saves that you've done manually. The fact that a little autosave icon comes up in the corner whenever you enter a map doesn't actually matter because the game isn't saving your spot. You aren't going to be able to go back to that point in time. In fact, the game doesn't even have a continue button. It has new game, delete game, or load game. Going to the records button also shows you that there's actually no point in time in which this is useful for story mode. There's a little part of the records section that says save records, which you would assume would mean that you could load an autosave, but that's not what it does. It just saves all of your records as they currently are, which shouldn't matter if the game has an autosave system, because if you exit the game mode you're in, it's going to all be lost anyway. There's no point to this part of the menu existing. Anyway, with that big headache out of the way, I played through the rest of the game, understanding that the game didn't autosave, which kind of made the rest of my gameplay a little bit better. I got about 75% of the way through the game when I finally unlocked the Pursuit, which is your fast travel system, and this is when I learned some really big parts about the base gameplay. Firstly, going back to combat, I learned that the way that the game wants you to use skills is not the way you would normally use skills in combat, at least not the way that I understand skills in MMOs or other types of RPGs. The game wants you to kind of frantically be tapping your skill buttons, which doesn't help when they go on such long cooldowns that you kind of can't pay attention to because, once again, you're trying to pay attention to the enemies and their placements. This is also the point of the game in which I realized the game doesn't really give you choice when it comes to fighting enemies. It gives you more of an illusion of choice. Enemies will be standing in the middle of a big hallway, and if you really don't want to fight them, especially if you've been kind of sucking at the game recently, you're going to think, oh, I'm just going to walk around them, probably farthest away from them so I don't enter their kind of line of battle. This is an illusion. There is almost never a point in which you can actually walk past enemies and avoid fighting them. Personally speaking, I feel like this kind of goes against being friendly to the players by not giving them agency in how they want to go along a map. Yes, there can be scripted battles like boss battles or important fights before bosses or before important events, but forcing your players to fight every single enemy they come across, especially if they're having a hard time grasping the fighting system of the game, really doesn't give your game a good light, especially to new players. There are in fact a few things that are kind of an illusion. During this point of the game, I discovered that despite the fact that the developer themselves says that light-colored doors are interactable and dark-colored doors are not, this is not true. There's no actual real indication to tell you that something is interactable or not unless you walk up to it, and even then, if it's not a door, it will not give you a thing to tell you, hey, this is interactable. Doors in the game are colored light or dark, and this is meant to tell you whether or not a door is meant to be opened or walked through. However, this gets thrown out of the way when you realize that sometimes dark doors just open for you, and sometimes light doors just don't. However, despite all these revelations, I actually did find myself kind of enjoying the second part of the game, and by that I mean kind of the last 30 to 25% of the game. Although I do wish that there were a way to traverse around a little bit faster, but that's kind of a minor issue. The game gives you a number of playable characters, which, in my opinion, gives you a really good plethora of playstyles that you can kind of pick and choose from. And you can pick and choose what characters are your favorite to have on your team. Despite the fact that there are about, I want to say 10 playable characters in the game, you can only have 3 on your team at a time, which I think is a little bit fair, but can sometimes kind of get in the way of the way you want to play the game. Now, luckily for me, and some other people that are interested in this game might have this luck happen to them as well, I was able to get my skills kind of pat down to a point where my team members, by the end of the game, were almost never taking damage. They were constantly at full health, and that kind of made the game more bearable than it was before. Now that we've got gameplay out of the way, let's talk about the other parts of this game. The story of the Demon Rush is big and grandiose and kind of fitting for an RPG. It's pretty much what you expect when you're entering a large open world RPG. A thing that I found silly is the way that they name the characters. Sometimes you'll get kind of sci-fi fantasy sounding names like Cherry Venus or Evif or Cook Falsh, and then other times you'll just encounter a character whose name is Jimmy. I personally feel like this made the story a little bit more fun, especially since it was very clear that the developer was trying to put in comedy into the game, and I feel like sometimes their comedy does hit pretty well. While I think the developer of the game had a really fun and kind of cool idea for the way they wanted to play out the story, it was kind of overly complex, and the way that characters talk doesn't help that situation. The game takes place during an interplanetary war between 3 planets, technically 2, Altair, Thormia, and Rosselhaug, where Rosselhaug has kind of been cut off from the other 2, and Thormia and Altair are kind of in the middle of this battle. Personally speaking, I feel like having war stories in your fantasy or sci-fi games, especially if they're big RPGs, is kind of a weird thing. I feel like it should be avoided unless you handle it in kind of a simple sense. And unfortunately, the Demon Rush falls into this trap that I feel like a lot of games that revolve around war fall into, where it is just too complicated for its own good. And this leads to characters talking unnaturally. Most of the time, characters are kind of just spewing exposition at you, and this leads to dialogue being so extensive that it's kind of hard to follow along with what's supposed to be happening in the story, or what they're trying to tell you happened in the past, what might happen in the future. It's all kind of difficult to keep track of. I only had, by the end of the game, a very vague idea of exactly what was happening. And the way that characters speak isn't just stuck to the story. Characters will also just make logical leaps that don't seem to make sense given the evidence or circumstances that they are put in. And it really makes for this weird kind of plot armory type of thing for almost every character that's introduced to you. Characters just seem to know everything without having to deal with figuring things out. This bleeds over into enemies and heroes, where they kind of just are allowed things to happen to them with seemingly no consequences, or if there are consequences, they aren't very lasting. This leads to an issue later on in the story where you see characters get character growth, but their character growth is really only talked about and not really shown. I do think the idea of the story is fun, I just think it needs a little bit more refining. The art direction, as I've both talked about and should be apparent by the gameplay that you've seen throughout this video, takes on a very minimalistic approach, which I think adds to the charm of the game a lot. And on top of this, the animations and cutscenes give a very early 3D animation from Adult Swim type of feel that only adds to the charm. For the most part, enemy designs are kind of stagnant, but once you get into the later parts of the game, you get some kind of fun enemy designs that start bleeding into more sci-fi slash fantasy tropes when it comes to enemies, and they look really nice, especially in that minimalist low poly style. I really enjoyed it. The game's sound design is incredibly minimal when it comes to cutscenes, which can lead to specifically musicless parts of the cutscenes, which happen frequently, being very awkward, especially without voice acting in the game. There's kind of just a complete silence as you're watching these characters do things and talk to each other, and on occasion a sound effect will be added when a character does something. In the overworld game, it's a little bit better. You actually get sounds when you're doing stuff or interacting with stuff sometimes, and it makes the game feel a little bit better sound design-wise. The music in the Demon Rush is fine. I would say that it's MIDI, but the developer has been very clear that it is not MIDI in their own words, so I'm just gonna take their word on that. Despite the fact that there are only about 2 to 3 tracks throughout the whole game, I think they're fine. They don't really get annoying despite the fact that they're on loop, especially if you think of them as more of an ambient sound. They kind of just fill the world when you're walking around. With all that being said, at the end of the day, the Demon Rush is a game that exists. The Demon Rush Legends Corrupt stands as a passion project that doesn't quite hit the mark. I find it incredibly difficult to recommend this game. However, if you are a fan of indie games, if you like RPGs and you don't quite mind controls not being great, the camera not being great, and the fact that combat is kind of frustrating, go ahead and try the Demon Rush Legends Corrupt. Taking a look at Dragoon Entertainment's game catalog, it looks like a lot of their games have been delisted and are currently unavailable to play. And that's really sad to see. I hope that if the developer watches this video, that they take all these criticisms and use them to improve upon their craft. I paid for this game, and I will not say that I regret my decision, because I wanted to buy this game, if I'm being honest. And overall, even though I don't recommend it, I did enjoy the game. Please make more games and just take criticism as it is and use it to improve upon your craft and make something great. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found something to enjoy about this video. The gameplay from this video was mostly taken solo, but some of it was taken from my review stream, which I do sometimes. If you'd like to see me play games that I may or may not talk about on this channel, you can find me at twitch.tv/ToxyTCG, and I'll link it down below. How do you feel about the Demon Rush? If you played it before, if you haven't, let me know how this video made you feel, and if you have, let me know how you thought about the game. I would like to see other opinions. Like I said, I kind of enjoyed the game a little bit, but it was kind of a frustrating ordeal. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and until next time, drink your water.